Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's James Dyke. I'm one of the co-chairs of Sustainability Site Southampton. We can read a little bit more on this very fetching banner over there. And I would like to welcome you to the University of Southampton's contribution to World Environment Day. The purpose behind this day is a celebration of positive environmental impacts, and the project that we're going to hear about today, Wallasea Island project, certainly fits the bill. It's a great example of positive socio-ecological linking. So we've got this massive infrastructure project going on, Crossrail, that you've most probably heard about, and a kind of a consequence, or one of the impacts of this project, is going to prove to be very beneficial in terms of biodiversity, climate change adaptation, resilience, and also people's quality of life, their ability to enjoy the natural environment. To tell us about it is Chris Tyas from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. Chris first joined the RSPB in 1982.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so in those 3 decades he's had a variety of field positions and in-office positions, and since 2009 he's been the project manager of this really quite massive, in fact it's quite awe-inspiring project. Chris is going to talk for about 45 minutes, after which there'll be a 15-minute question and answer session, and then we can get back to the free wine and food. So, without further ado, over to you, Chris.
I can always speak for 15 minutes and we'll get to the wine even quicker. Yeah. Right, so yes, the Wallasea Island Wild Coast project. So I've been based in Essex for over 20 years now. I'm actually from South Yorkshire, so I'm doing a bit of missionary work in the south of England. But Essex is a wonderful county, and we do get put off by all the jokes. We're insulated from the jokes living in Essex, but I'm sure they still are out there. But 440 kilometres of coast, 350,000 birds using it. So the joke's on everyone else, I always think. Right, 3 logos up there. So we've got Defra. Defra have got a managerial alignment on Wallasea already, 115 hectare compensatory site, which we'll come back to. We need to cross their land in order to bring our material ashore. The material is coming from Crossrail in the first instance, biggest civil engineering project in Europe. They're providing a little bit less than half of what we need, and we've got the Environment Agency up there. EA, obviously they're a regulator for the project, but they're in there as a partner because they're providing money for the scheme in order to get some compensatory habitat for lost habitats elsewhere in Essex. So a quick summary of what I'm going to tell you about. So that's a nice summer plumage grey plover, one of the species that we're going to be attracting to Wallasea. So I'll give you an introduction to the Wild Coast project, a little bit on the All Fleets Marsh, the Defra site, and then an update on where we are at the moment and where we're heading to in the future with the project. So before we move to Wallasea, RSPB's been involved in a number of big habitat creation schemes. Good example of that is the Hanson project, which we now call Ooze Fen. So that's ultimately going to be the largest reed bed in the UK, and being created by the removal of 28 million tonnes of aggregate. So obviously quite different to Wallasea. At Wallasea we're raising the land, here they're lowering the land, but using the same sorts of machines to create habitat, a big habitat again, similar sized habitat. Quite a good map there on the bottom right there. We can see it's built up in a cellular fashion. I think there are 5 cells completed to date, and ultimately, obviously depending on the speed the aggregate is removed, then the habitat will be created. A long-term project. Wallace's a long-term project. This one's actually probably slightly longer. It's already got breeding bittern, along with a range of other wetland species. So 3 of the main drivers for our project, and main drivers along the coast, is loss of habitat due to sea level rise, climate change, salt marsh being squeezed against hard sea defences. 30,000 hectares by 2050 was a prediction some years ago. It may be a bit less, but it certainly will be a significant amount of habitat. And obviously if we're going to replace those habitats, we need the right solutions in place in order to do it. And another key factor is the public. Obviously, these areas along the coast have taken a long time to create. I mean, Wallasea Island was claimed 400 years ago from the sea. So knocking holes in the seawall and putting it back to the sea isn't popular on all fronts. So we've got something to do there in terms of raising public awareness and selling the project. Bottom right, regulated tide gates. Two real ways you can create coastal habitats behind an existing seawall. One is what we call regulated tidal exchange, using sluices, existing sluices or new sluices, to let the water through the sea defence and creating habitat behind an intact wall. Or we can do managed realignment. In the background you might just be able to make out a couple of breaches in a seawall. That's Freeston Shore, one of the sites that the RSPB has been involved in. And there you can see it on the right here, that's Freeston Shore, 70 hectare site on the Lincolnshire Wash. The last bit of the wash to be claimed from the sea, I think, by North Sea Camp, the prison service. And it's now been put back to the sea to create new habitat. Nig Bay on the left, on the Cromarty Firth, another site that the RSPB's been involved in. So Freeston was the largest realignment when it was created at about 70 hectares. At Wallasea we're not quite going to be 10 times the size, but we're looking at 680 hectares of new coastal habitat, so not far off 10 times the size of Freeston. Four main aims for the project, mentioned one of them already, replacement of lost habitats. We are losing habitats along the coast and it's important to recreate those habitats, so that's one of the key factors, probably the most important factor. Another issue with our project, an issue for Wallasea Island, is that it's a big island in a relatively small estuary system, and whatever happens on Wallasea has a big impact on the estuary. Currently the sea defences aren't being maintained, so at some stage in the future there'll be an unmanaged breach, at which point a lot of water comes onto the island and causes problems to the estuary. So we're providing a sustainable solution for the estuary with our scheme. Obviously, being the RSPB, we're keen to create a new nature reserve and an accessible bit of coastline. Quite a bit of the Essex coast isn't as accessible as it could be, so we're looking to create an accessible piece and also connect people with their coastal heritage. Lots of a rich history along the coast, and we're looking to interpret that for them as part of our scheme. And we want to move the science forward. No one's done managerial alignment on this sort of scale in the UK before, so we're looking to move the science forward on the creation of bigger sites. And it is Europe's largest intertidal habitat creation project of its type. I did a talk in Germany back in February, and I wouldn't say I was dreading, but I was interested to see the reaction to that statement, and no one contradicted me. It was an audience, principally Germans, but quite a lot of Dutch, French and Belgians as well, and no one contradicted me. It's certainly the largest land raising scheme and possibly the largest area of realignment as well. So this is Wallasea Island. Tidal causeway just off the map. All the infrastructure at this end, including Grapnell's farm, and this is the extent of the island. This area here along the northern shore of the island is the Allfleet's Marsh, the Defra site. So we've got this is the Crouch estuary running along here. I'm not controlling this mouse very well, am I? And this is the Roach estuary in the background here, running off towards Rochford in the distance here. And this is Southend Pier, looking across towards Kent, Thames estuary here, Foulness. Also, quite important to note, Burnham on Crouch here, which is the other side of the estuary, 50-minute drive round, but only 800 metres across the channel. So we're very keen to bring as many people in via that route as we can, as we'll come back to. So this is the current state of the island. So it was claimed from the sea 400 years ago as sheep pasture, and it's been managed as a farmed environment since then. It's only really since it was flooded in 1953, along with a lot of the Essex coast, Kent coast, and it was converted to arable shortly after that. So it's only got a fairly recent history as an arable farm, and it was a model of farm drainage. So it was levelled quite effectively, and a drainage system put in place. But if you look from the air, you can see the usual sort of crop marks there, and you can see just about make out the old creek network out on the fields there. So the history of the it might have been bulldozed and converted to arable, but the history is there in the crop marks of all the. I've compared it with previous maps showing the creeks, and not surprisingly, the marks on this aerial photograph mark the location of the creeks. So in terms of what it's going to look like when we've finished, this is Margaretha Koog, which is in Denmark, and this is actually similar sorts of habitats, but created from the opposite end, really. At Wallasea, where we've got an area of dry land that we're going to turn back to the sea. Here, they had an area of sea that they enclosed with a polder and created the similar sort of habitat, but from the opposite direction. The big flock of birds in the middle there is around 50,000 knot, so these sites do attract good numbers of birds. Sorts of birds we're going to get, the usual suspects really that use the Essex coast already, the Brent geese, a range of other wildfowl including shelder, widgeon, teal, those sorts of things, and obviously a whole range of different wading birds as well, including the knot would be a key species, the most important bird along the Essex coast statistically. If you look at the populations, about 12% of the world population of the knot use the Essex coast. So we're going to attract a lot of the species that do use the adjacent estuary already, but we're speculating on a few more unusual things, such as spoonbill. They're starting to breed in the UK again recently, up in North Norfolk. The Holcombe estate is where they've been breeding, but they do breed in similar habitats in Holland to the ones that we're going to create. So we would certainly hope ultimately to attract spoonbill as a breeder, but it would be on the icing on the cake. It would be nice to think they would come. And slightly more speculative is something like the black-winged stilt, which again, if you go down to the Mediterranean, in fact actually not that far across the channel, you can find black-winged stilts breeding along the Atlantic French coast. They do breed occasionally in the UK. We're creating the right habitat, so why not black-winged stilts and maybe even Kentish plovers as well. This is an artist's impression of what it'll look like, and also the sorts of birds that would use it. All of the species on this map have been seen on the Defra site, the Allfleet's Marsh site, apart from this little group here, which are twite, which are it's the mountain equivalent of the linnet, comes down to the coast for the winter from the Pennines. They've declined hugely, and that's the reason we haven't had them at Wallasea. Not that the habitat is there, it's just that the birds are quite scarce now. So a little bit about Allfleet's Marsh. The thing to note on this picture here is you can see this pale brown area here. That's a bund which holds back this material here, which is Harwich dredged material, maintenance dredged silt from Harwich that was placed behind this bund to raise the rear of the site. The big issue with Wallasea is it's very low lying, about a metre above ordnance datum, so a big spring tide would put it under at least 2 metres of water. So in order to get anything other than mudflat habitat, you need to raise the ground, which is what Defra had to do to get their salt marsh. Another picture of the Defra site along the north of the island. It's in 3 sections. There's a modest section here, bigger section in the middle here, and the biggest section, although it's foreshortened by the picture, is at the far end here. 115 hectares, and you can see this linear salt marsh area, or seeded. I mean, it's ready to become salt marsh. This is actually the day it was breached. So obviously the salt marsh hasn't formed yet, but it's there ready at the right height to get salt marsh to form. And this is the design. So again, as I said, in 3 separate sections, 6 breaches in the seawall. Defra were tasked with producing roosting islands, mudflat habitat, both of which are quite easy. You can scrape material to get islands, you can get the mudflat at the existing ground height. To get the salt marsh was more tricky. They had to import the material to raise the rear of the site. And then 6 breaches in the seawall. So this is the salt marsh creation. So a metre diameter pipe, material brought down from Harwich by ship and pumped to shore, retained by this bund along the rear of the site. So this shows just before the site was breached, just over a year on, and then 2 years on. So again, you've got a salt marsh at the bottom there. Obviously it's not a fully functioning salt marsh. It's nothing like the salt marsh outside the seawall, the existing salt marsh. But by definition it is a salt marsh. It takes quite a long time. There's been quite an issue recently about the quality of newly created salt marshes, but we just have to wait long enough for them to actually develop sufficiently. One of the first managerial alignments is on Northey Island, a National Trust site on the Blackwater. I actually do a Webb's high tide count there, and I walk past this managerial alignment, and to the layman, well, to me as well, it looks just like a piece of salt marsh that's been there for forever, but it's actually been there for just over 20 years, which is how long it needs to become something similar to the other salt marsh adjacent to the estuary. So progress on Allfleet's Marsh. It is developing very well. It's into its 7th year now. It's behaving as predicted. So I mean, this was a site that was created to compensate for habitats lost to port development up at Fagbury Flats, next to Felixstowe, and also Lapple Bank down on the Medway. Those were the areas. It was an RSPB court case that caused the need for Allfleet's Marsh to be created. So we took the UK government to the European Court because of these areas that were left out of SPA designation. We argued that they should have been included in the SPA, and then as and when they were lost, then there should be compensation. So there was a need for compensation, and the government finally got their act together and created a new site. So the most important thing was that obviously the site has been created, but it needed to be created without affecting the adjacent estuary in a significant way. The adjacent estuary is an SPA, so the last thing we want to do is recreate a new bit of SPA whilst affecting the adjacent estuary, and it's behaving as it was predicted to do. It's a net importer of sediment, so the sediment's increasing by about 2 inches per annum, which is a very healthy, reasonably healthy sedimentation rate. Very good bird populations using the site, and it actually hit its bird targets in year 5, and actually there were twice as many birds in terms of roosting and in terms of feeding, so that was very, very good. I mean, it's actually created at twice the size of the loss, so 115 hectares was twice the area that was lost. It's ended up supporting twice as many birds, but it's probably true to say that if you'd made it half the size, it wouldn't have supported the number of birds that were required, because a smaller site would almost certainly be more disturbed, and we would normally insist on at least 2 to 1, if not a 3 to 1 ratio of compensatory area. 93 different species of bird using the site. That's not just flying over, that's birds physically using it in some way. And spectacular bird numbers for 115 hectares, so over 12,000 birds as the sum of the winter peaks. And if you compare that with the Webb's data for the adjacent estuary, the equivalent figure is 34,000 on the whole of the Crouch Roach system. So creating a good quality bit of mudflat is certainly supporting the birds. Couple of stats for you. So the peak of 205 avocets, which is a nationally important population. There's around 2,500 avocets winter in Essex. It's an increasing species. Reasonably good numbers of dunlin. Well, obviously, both the avocet and the dunlin are feeding birds, but we also get good numbers of loafing birds. Obviously, it's important to provide feeding, loafing and roosting function of the estuary, and lapwing tend to feed at night inland, but need somewhere safe and undisturbed to sit around during the day. So again, 2,500 plus lapwings was a good total. Right, so if we move on to the Wild Coast project now. So we've acquired 744 hectares, principally arable land, but also some salt marsh, these bits of salt marsh outside the seawall. Everything from here, ignoring this little block here, going this way out to the far end of the island, is now owned by the RSPB, and you've got, as I've mentioned earlier, this is the Defra scheme along the northern side of the island. So I use Wembley Stadium as an example. I tried Olympic swimming pools and I tried football pitches, but Wembley's a good example. If their website is correct, the internal capacity, if you imagine Wembley filled to the roof with water or mud, whatever you want to fill it with, the internal cubic capacity is about 4 million metres cubed. So you just need to remember 4 million metres cubed. So we started talking to the farm in the year 2000. I first went to Wallasea in 1999, so reasonably long lead-in time. We have some very long lead-in times for some of our reserves. Some of them happen quite quickly, but I mean that's probably an average amount of time. From, I think we started to acquire the land in 2010, so a 10-year lead-in time. Obviously we're very keen. We were talking to the farm confidentially when Defra decided to recreate their Allfleet's Marsh on Wallasea, so we were very keen to be the managers of that site. Lots of money spent on studies in order to be sure that we were going to get the habitats we wanted and we could do it without affecting the adjacent estuary, etc. And we got this issue of if you breach Wallasea in an unmanaged way, which is going to happen because at some stage in the future, if we hadn't decided to do what we're doing, then the seawalls would have failed and you get 11 million cubic metres of water coming onto the island, 3 Wembley's worth of water in effect. And our studies showed us that we could let about half of Wembley's worth on to be sustainable in terms of the effects on the adjacent estuary and also enough water to create the habitats we wanted. So we announced an option to buy the land in 2007, a 2-year option, in order to do the studies and work out whether it was feasible, find some money, etc. And we were going down the regulated tidal exchange route, so we're thinking of using sluices to let the water in, so creating habitats at a lower level. We were talking to dredging companies about the potential to bring in dredgings to build the island up, because obviously at some stage the seawalls would fail and we'd end up with a managerial alignment anyway. But when we went public, Crossrail came to us initially with Thames Water, and it's a big tunnelling project under London. They're generating material which we can use on the island to raise the ground, which in effect allowed us to go down the managerial alignment route. So we import the material. We import 7.5 million metres cubed of material to build the island up to the point where it just allows the 2 million cubic metres of sustainable water on. And that allows us to go down the managerial alignment route. So this is the Crossrail route. So they go below ground at Paddington and they pop up down on the Isle of Dogs, just away from the Isle of Dogs and almost up to Stratford, and there's a spur down to Heathrow. So quite a lot, like I said earlier, Europe's largest civil engineering project. It's £14.8 billion project. So quite big in full size train. So in theory you could get on your train at Southampton and end up in Norwich without having to get off your train. No need to decant onto the tube. Full size trains, obviously 2 tunnels, one each way. And here's Boris launching the scheme. A great advocate for the project. We haven't managed to get him out to Wallasea yet. We've been trying. It'd be quite amusing, but he hasn't come yet one of these years. So this is a bit of a complicated picture, but you can see Wallasea there with its 4.5 million tonnes of material, and that's coming out of 3 locations on the Thames. So you've got Limo here, 1.3 million tonnes. Barking Riverside, now known as the Docklands Transfer Site, 1.5 million tonnes. Then Northfleet, down in Kent, the old Lafarge Cement Works, 1.7 million tonnes. So leading to 4.5 million tonnes at Wallasea. I mean, I was talking cubic metres earlier, and it's not an exact science really, but we reckon about 4 million tonnes will be enough to complete the first of our intertidal cells. So Crossrail, biggest civil engineering project, is still only providing 1 of our 3 intertidal cells. So this is the design. So this is the cell here that Crossrail are going to be working on, which is about 150 hectares, and there are 2 other similar intertidal cells, each with breaches. Material from Crossrail and others built up in subtle different grind height variations to get all the different habitats. Lagoons within the salt marsh, a big regulated tidal exchange here, about 90 hectares, with 3 sluice structures, 1 in and 2 out. And then behind this final line of sea defence we've got what we call Cell 5, which has got compensatory habitats, grazing marsh, saline lagoon and some wild bird cover. I'm going to have to speed up a bit. So what we're doing is we're taking this flat arable landscape, blank canvas if you like, and painting a nice salt marsh picture all over it. Turning the clock back 400 years really. Quick summary of what I've said so far. So we're creating this new habitat. It's a bit of wilderness Essex, but it is pretty close to some quite large populations. We're importing 7.5 million metres cubed of material, initially from Crossrail, to get this flow of water on and off down to about 2 million. I'm going to place this fill, subtle different grind height variations to get all the different habitats. We're building it up in cells, which manages the flood risk, so 3 intertidal cells and a regulated tidal exchange. And we haven't decided yet whether we'll have a visitor centre. We may do, we may not. We've got planning permission for everything else, the 5 hides, 15 kilometres of new footpath, etc. And it is a sustainable solution for the estuary. If we don't do this project, then the estuary, or Wallasea's effect on the estuary is quite alarming. Lots of consents involved, most important being the planning consent, which was from Essex County Council because it's a waste planning application. A whole range of other consents there. You can't go around knocking holes in seawalls without having a lot of permissions in place. And we've got all the permissions we need for this stage of the project. A few licences involved. Obviously our planning permission's got a Section 106 agreement covering effects on the surrounding area, traffic, the need for a local liaison group, etc. We need access across the Defra site in order to bring the material ashore. We've got 2 power cables on site which need relocating. One of them needs relocating, so they'll be aligned with our counter walls. We've got the partnership with the agency I mentioned earlier for them to be recreating habitats. Obviously we can't do anything without the land, and we need Crossrail on board, so they're on site under licence delivering the habitats that we need. Lots of consultation involved. This is the public consultation to do with the planning application. We had another round of public consultation just after we announced the option as well. So as part of the critical path there were some enabling works that were required, and it was ahead of Crossrail coming on site, so we were in charge of doing those works. That was the first phase of the water vole mitigation works. We've got protected species issues on site, so we needed to recreate some water vole habitat, get that going, and we needed the base for the conveyor belt, which again was required so it could be sufficiently stabilised and ready for Crossrail. And we got the work finished and it was under budget, which is always pleasing. It was about £300,000 worth of work. This is the water vole area, so it's about 3.5 hectares of land, network of quite deep steep-sided creeks and lagoons and islands. Lowered the ground by about 0.8 of a metre and then dug the creek network into that lowered area. This is the one of the creeks here with a little shelf there for the voles to nestle into. There's a bit of an issue. We had a long debate about this, the sides of these and whether they were going to be stable. And they have actually slumped in some places, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It creates vertical cliffs which the voles like. This is it shortly after completion. We'll come back to that a bit later. This is the route for the conveyor belt. I'll show you. This is an earlier design, so you've got this jetty out on the estuary. Well, I'll come back to that. But the main thing about the access for the conveyor belt was building up this berm behind the old sea defence, building on an existing bank, which was obviously below sea level now that Defra had flooded the land, so that needed to be built up. And this is the construction of that bund, and that's the completion of the base for the conveyor belt, looking from seaward back to landward. So what's been happening? So the loading facility took about a year to build. Obviously no work allowed in the winter because of disturbance to the Defra site, which obviously made the work last a little bit longer. Had the first material ashore in August last year. Had a formal project launch on the 17th of September last year. Cell 1, I'll come back to what we're doing at the moment, but Cell 1 is scheduled to be breached in 2015, but my money's on 2016. It could even stray into 2017. It is a long-term project. And there'll be phased addition of visitor facilities. We can get the habitats in Cell 5 sorted out because it's behind the final line of sea defence. It'll be a while before we can do anything with the intertidal cells. They've got to be breached and made safe before we can use them. And we've got a current backstop date from a planning point of view of 2019, but we are going to extend that through to about 2025, which we will finish by 2025 one way or another, even if it involves redesigning the final cell. This is the jetty under construction. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but it had to be built in Poland because none of the UK shipyards could produce it in time, which was a shame. But there we are. We weren't in control of where it was built. Once we hand the site to Crossrail and they deliver what we want. So this is the loading infrastructure on the jetty, which was fitted out at Tilbury Docks. And this is an aerial view of the jetty. So it's capable of handling 2,500 ton ships. Comes ashore by conveyor belt to a rotating spreader arm here that moves through about 240 degrees. Throughput of about 500 tonnes an hour, so it's industrial scale, but if you're bringing in 7.5 million metres cubed of material, you need some serious kit to do it. That's a view of the jetty from the sea with 4 diggers, 2 for each ship. So the site's going to be built up in stages, different colours here. The final area will be the pink area, and again that's all about protected species management. The existing Borodike has got the most water vole and reptile activity, so that's the bit that's done last really. So moving on to protected species, so we've got a range of protected species. So we've got water voles. For them we're doing a combination of displacement and trapping and relocating. Reptiles are being trapped and relocated. Badgers, each of these dots here are badger sets, or mostly outliers. There's one main set here, an artificial set down here. So again, they're closed under license, again to ease them to the west slowly. And this is the water vole area that I showed you. Reptile relocation area, one of the reptile relocation areas there. So protected species management has been quite complex, but we are where we need to be at the moment in terms of protected species. It's the artificial badger set under construction. Reptile relocation area with fencing, which will be removed probably at the end of this year, and that's a new hibernacular and bank for basking in amongst the relocation area. And this is the watervole area is an interesting one. We created it well ahead of time, allowed it to develop, but the problem we've got is that there are watervoles in the Borodite nearby, and whatever state the watervole area is in, it's going to be at full capacity with watervoles. So what we had to do, or what Crossrail had to do, was boost the available habitat very quickly by planting vegetation to get it to the point where it was capable of supporting about 30 watervoles, and we also had to produce other areas to accommodate the numbers of watervoles we had in cell 1. We've got 2 further phases of watervole habitat to create, so again we're going to have to modify those based on current. It's a learning process as we go on, and we will get to the point where we're doing the right thing by these species. We're going to be far better for reptiles over time. We'll have no net loss of watervoles, and badgers will be eased out to the west. They are an issue with ground nesting birds, so we have to move them out of the way. So a couple of recent pictures, not the best, but this is the conveyor belt coming ashore, and you can see some spoil there being managed. So currently, as of a couple of days ago, they brought in just over 400,000 tonnes of material out of this total of 4.5 million. So it's been slightly slower coming in than we would have hoped. There have been a few teething problems with the infrastructure, but we are getting that sorted. And this shows, this bank here is the surcharging of an area where one of these structures for our saline lagoon is going to go. So they're seriously big structures. You're talking 90 hectares of salt water with water coming in and out. So they're serious structures. So that's the first of those structures being surcharged. So moving back to cell 5, this is the final line of sea defence here. So what we're going to create there is a saline lagoon, about 20 hectare saline lagoon with an overflow salt pan area, further overflowing into a saline creek network. We'd have liked to create more fresh or brackish water, but we've only got it's an island, so we haven't got a finite amount of fresh water, so we're going to use bunding and pumping to create a wet grassland grazing marsh system here. And this is the edge of the wild bird cover area. So we've got issues with farmland birds on site. It's a very good, surprisingly good area for farmland birds. So we've created an area for principally aimed at wintering birds, and it's supported as many as 800 corn buntings, probably the biggest flock in the country. I mean, Essex is particularly good for corn buntings. We're also employing a farmland bird advisor for 5 years to work with local farmers so that we don't see the need to have no net loss of corn buntings and farmland birds, because the site is threatened by sea level rise anyway. It's going to be lost to the sea at some stage in the not too distant future. But we are working with local farmers, and we probably will end up with no net loss of habitat, because we've been quite successful in recruiting the farmers with the right land in the right places. We aspire to create a piece of coastal grazing marsh. This is Old Hall Marshes, which is the site I moved to Essex to manage. Described by our senior ecologist as the best, probably the best coastal grazing marsh in Britain. Bit of a lager advert almost. But it is a superb area, and if you look at that, you might think it was salt marsh. I mean, it's salt marsh that was claimed again 400 years. So there is a seawall all the way around it. You can cross to Abbots Hall if you know your Essex. This is Abbots Hall realignment here, pre-realignment. In fact, it looks like they were actually getting ready for it there. So yeah, I mean, we're not going to recreate Old Hall, but we're going to create something that's a new bit of coastal grazing marsh. We've got 90% loss of grazing marsh in Essex since 1930, so it's important that new bits are created. Got a bit of public engagement work, not surprising, probably more than the average developer would do. So we had these consultation events. This is the one I said to you before was at Burnham. This one was at Rochford. We do talks to interest groups, including today's talk. Obviously site visits. It's important to see Wallasea. I mean, you see it on a map and then you see it in the flesh. It's quite an eye-opener really, the scale. And we do regular events. Had a Wild Coast weekend last year attracting over 2,000 people, so we're keen to get as many people to see it as possible. And we do regular news updates to all interested parties. And we've got a local liaison group which was set up as part of our Section 106 agreement with Essex County Council. We would have had a local liaison group anyway, but we formally had to have one via that agreement, and that pulls together all the key local stakeholders for 6 monthly meetings. So just 2 more slides. So in terms of the nature reserve, I mentioned earlier we've got planning permission for everything except the visitor centre. We've got planning permission for 5 hides. We'd look to use one of those hides as what we call a reception hide, so a super hide really, mini visitor centre, just to test the water really. I'll be surprised if we don't have a visitor centre in the future, but we want to test the water first. And the other thing we're going to do is create the habitats first and then look how the birds use it and then retrofit the visitor facilities to it. So we've got lines on the map, but those could well change depending on how the birds use the site. My best guess is 30 to 50,000 visitors. I know Minsmere, for instance, gets about 90,000. Rainham Marshes, I think, is on about 25,000. So we'll see. We don't know how many we're going to get until we get out there marketing it. We get about 10,000 visitors at the moment, principally coming to as a result of our publicity, plus obviously the Defra site that's already there. I showed earlier that Burnham's only 800 metres across the channel, so we're quite keen to attract as many people in from Burnham as possible. We're looking to have our own dedicated jetty. There already is a ferry service to the island from Burnham, but it goes into the marina, which is a little bit too far away at the moment. So we're looking to have our own dedicated jetty to bring people in. And I think it'll make a nice day out. You can arrive by train at Burnham, and spend some money in the town, and then come across to have a look at Wallasea. It is a wilderness in Essex terms. It'll attract a range of people, hopefully from a reasonable distance away, but obviously local people, community groups are going to be the key local audience. And this is we need to get this changed actually, because it still says 2019. I think it seemed a long way off in 2008 when we put in for planning permission, but it soon comes round. So we are looking at as a finishing date now of 2025. I think that is my last slide actually, so I've finished 5 minutes early. But it's 1:45 on that clock. That's what I was working to. Okay, so that was the presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.